Right now, somewhere in America, 15 million people believe they have Cherokee blood. 15 million. That's not a small number of confused people. That's a population so large, it would make the Cherokee the single biggest indigenous nation in the history of the Western Hemisphere, bigger than the entire Aztec Empire at its height. The actual enrolled Cherokee Nation has 392,000 citizens. So somebody's math is catastrophically wrong. And now, for the first time in history, we have the technology to prove exactly how wrong it is. Here's what that technology found. The 5 founding genetic markers of true indigenous American ancestry, the ones that developed between 18 and 21,000 years ago in the ancestral population that crossed into the Americas from Siberia, are called haplogroups A2, B2, C1, D1, and X. These aren't estimates. They're not approximations. They're specific molecular signatures that have survived tens of thousands of years, and they still show up in the DNA of living indigenous people today. When researchers started cross-referencing the DNA of people who claimed Cherokee ancestry against those actual markers, the vast majority showed none of them. Not a trace, not a fraction of a percent, nothing. Now, how does that happen? How do 15 million people end up believing something that their own cells say isn't true? The answer is a story that's been building for 200 years. It's called the Cherokee Princess myth. It's the tale of the noble indigenous ancestor. Almost always a woman, almost always described as beautiful and dignified, passed down through Southern and Appalachian white families for generations. Yeah, it has a clinical name now in genetic anthropology, mythic ancestry. And it is, without question, the most widespread fabricated genealogy in American history. Nobody built it on purpose. It built itself, story by story, grandmother by grandmother, generation by generation, until it became so embedded in family identity that nobody thought to question it. Kim Tallbear, a citizen of the Sisseton Wahpeton Oyate, and a professor at the University of Alberta in Canada, spent years documenting exactly this phenomenon. She called commercial ancestry testing, the kind that promises to reveal your roots for $100 and a saliva swab, a form of biological colonialism. The latest mechanism, she argued, by which settler culture extracts something from indigenous people. This time, the resource being extracted isn't land. It's identity itself. If you've ever wondered where you really come from, and I mean really, then subscribe, because this is only the beginning. But here's the thing. The myth is only the surface layer of this story. Underneath it is a scientific failure so large it affected millions of existing DNA accounts. And the companies responsible have never fully acknowledged it in public, because the Cherokee weren't just misrepresented by family stories. They were misrepresented by the databases that were supposed to set the record straight. And the people who built those databases understood exactly what they were doing. Before we go any further, I want to hear from you. Has your family ever passed down a story about Native American ancestry? A Cherokee great-grandmother? An ancestor described as part Indian? Let's drop it in the comments right now, because by the end of this video, you'll know exactly what that story is worth genetically, and the answer might genuinely surprise you. The databases failed because they were broken from the beginning. Not broken by accident, broken by design, or more precisely, broken by a structural problem so fundamental that the scientists who built these systems had to have known about it. The Native American ethnicity category in Ancestry DNA and 23andMe isn't built from a comprehensive survey of indigenous American people. It's built from something called a reference panel, a small company-selected group of genomes used to calibrate what Native American DNA is supposed to look like. And for years, that panel was, in the measured words of researcher Nanibaa Garrison at the University of Washington, far too small to generalize across hundreds of distinct nations. Here's the structural problem, and it's almost impossible to solve. To identify Cherokee DNA specifically, you need a baseline, a verified collection of Cherokee genomes to measure against. But most federally recognized tribes, including the Cherokee Nation itself, have refused to participate in commercial DNA databases. And they have good reasons for that. There's a long and painful history of scientific abuse against indigenous populations in this country. There's real concern about how genomic data could be used to challenge enrollment, restrict sovereignty, or reopen legal battles that took generations to settle. So companies built their reference panels from a handful of consenting individuals, sometimes from a single tribe, and then extrapolated those markers across hundreds of genetically distinct peoples. The Cherokee, the Navajo, the Lakota, all collapsed into one category labeled Native American. Stop. I need you to understand the scale of what I'm describing. Ancestry DNA alone has processed over 22 million kits. We are talking about millions of accounts generating results that no tribe approved, no indigenous scientist validated, and no enrollment office would recognize. Millions of people holding a printed percentage they were never entitled to. Kim Tallbear spent years documenting exactly this. Her research showed that a person with Latin American mestizo ancestry, carrying ancient Mesoamerican Indigenous DNA from Mexico or Guatemala, could receive an Ancestry DNA result, labeling them Cherokee. The algorithm didn't have the resolution to tell the difference, and for years it didn't try. The consequences were concrete. People brought their printed DNA results to tribal enrollment offices as evidence of descent. Tribal administrators had to build formal policy just to respond to paperwork they had never validated and could not control. By 2019, some companies had quietly updated their reference panels. In certain accounts, existing Cherokee percentages were silently revised downward, in documented cases, to 0. No notification, no explanation. The number just changed. And that discovery, that silent revision, raises a question that this technology still cannot answer. What did the real, ancient Cherokee genome actually look like? Before the revision, before the commercial tests, before colonialism, before the Trail of Tears, before anything that touched them from the outside? That answer isn't in a database. It's buried in the Appalachian Mountains, in bones that are 3,000 years old. And what those bones contain is not what anyone expected. Before there was a Cherokee Nation, before the clan system, before the ceremonies, before the language that linguists still cannot definitively connect to any other known language family in North America, there were people in the Appalachian Highlands who left no name for themselves, only bones. When those bones were sequenced, saying the genetic markers they carried were exactly what you'd expect from the founding populations of the Americas, haplogroups A2, B2, C1, and D1, the 4 ancient maternal lineages confirmed by geneticist Nadia Fagundes and her team in 2008 to have diverged from Asian populations between 18 and 21,000 years ago, before the first humans crossed into the Americas. These were real people with a real, ancient, and continuous presence in those mountains. Not migrants passing through, not a temporary population. People who had been there, in that specific geography, for a very long time. And what made them genomically unusual wasn't just how old their lineage was, it was how stable it remained across centuries. While other eastern woodland peoples showed signs of significant movement and intermingling over time, the ancient Appalachian DNA record shows long stretches of near-perfect continuity. These highlands acted like a natural genetic vault. The mountains kept the population in and kept most outside influences out. Stay with me here, because this stability is the exact detail that makes what happened next so completely catastrophic. Within roughly 200 years of sustained European contact, that continuity was gone. The haplogroup diversity that had accumulated across thousands of years, the population structure, the deep ancestral layers, was compressed, diluted, and in some lineages, permanently erased. Scientists have a word for it: bottleneck, the genetic equivalent of a fire burning through a library. You can rebuild the building. You cannot recover what was lost. But here's what no history textbook ever taught you. When the fracture didn't start with European settlers, something was already shifting inside the indigenous world itself. A deep genomic entanglement between the Cherokee and a neighboring nation that had been building quietly for generations. They were called allies. They spoke a related language. They traded on the same rivers. And the DNA they share runs so deep that it raises a question nobody has been able to cleanly answer. Were the Cherokee and this other nation ever truly two separate peoples at all? Two peoples. That's the framework every history course uses. The Cherokee and the Muskogee Creek. two distinct southeastern nations, frequently in conflict, competing for the same territory across the same rivers and ridgelines. Two peoples, two origin stories, two sovereign identities. The DNA has a different number, 1. Population genetics research examining modern Cherokee Nation citizens alongside enrolled Muskogee Creek Nation members has found overlapping genomic profiles that predate European contact. Not the signature of occasional intermarriage, not the footprint of a few border communities trading spouses across generations. The genetic overlap is deep enough and old enough to suggest either a shared ancestral population or a sustained period of integration so complete that it never made it into any historical record. Nanibaa Garrison at the University of Washington documented this directly. Genetic tests simply cannot reliably distinguish between different southeastern indigenous nations because the populations themselves are too genomically entangled for any current reference panel to separate. And what makes that almost impossible to believe, what makes it genuinely strange, is the oral record that was sitting right there the whole time, waiting for someone to read it in a new way. In Cherokee tradition, there are documented accounts of adopted individuals from neighboring nations absorbed into Cherokee clans through ritual. Their original identity was formally erased from the clan record after one generation. Anthropologists treated this as a minor cultural footnote for decades. But think about what that practice means biologically. If it was widespread, if it was sustained across centuries, if it was symmetric, happening on both sides of the border, it is the precise biological mechanism that would produce exactly the genomic signature researchers are now finding. The oral tradition wasn't mythology. It was a genomic description of a living, ongoing process. If you watched our last video on the DNA found in Colombia that matches no living human on Earth, you already saw the first fracture in the story of American origins. The same unknown genetic thread we traced there, it connects directly to what we're uncovering right now. What did you make of that Colombian discovery? Tell me in the comments. Then stay with me, because in a few minutes, this story is going to intersect with exactly what you saw in that video. And before you think this is a technicality, understand what it means for every legal identity claim made over the past 150 years. The Cherokee genetic identity was always more fluid, more composite, and more intentionally constructed than anyone was taught to believe. And the boundaries drawn on colonial maps didn't reflect the boundaries in the genome. They never did. And then came the event that didn't just test that identity. It broke it, at the molecular level, in ways that are still measurable in living bodies today. In the winter of 1838 and 1839, approximately 16,000 Cherokee people were forced out of their ancestral homeland in the Appalachians and marched over 1,000 miles to Indian Territory in what is now Oklahoma. Roughly 4,000 people died on that march. History calls this a humanitarian atrocity. It was, but genomics calls it something else, a population bottleneck. And the difference between those two descriptions is the difference between a moral judgment and a biological fact, and both of them are true at the same time. A bottleneck leaves a specific fingerprint in DNA, reduced diversity, reduced variation across the genome, certain lineage markers amplified, not because they were selected for strength, but because the people who carried them happened to survive. The Trail of Tears functioned as an involuntary selective event. The people who completed that march were not a random cross-section of the Cherokee population. They were the young, the physically resilient, the ones whose bodies could absorb a winter march through frozen mountains with inadequate food, inadequate clothing, and no medical care. The elderly died disproportionately. The very young died disproportionately. The gene pool that arrived in Oklahoma was measurably different from the one that left the Appalachians. This isn't ancient history in a textbook. Well, the molecular signature of that march is in the DNA of living Cherokee people right now, in their cells, passed down from survivors. But the Trail of Tears produced a second genomic event that almost nobody talks about. Approximately 1,000 Cherokee people successfully evaded removal by hiding in the mountains of western North Carolina. They became the Eastern Band of Cherokee Indians, and their genome today is statistically distinct from the citizens of the Cherokee Nation of Oklahoma. Two branches of the same people, separated by one winter in 1838. Now carrying measurably different DNA, not because of different origins, but because of different survival. Elders of the Eastern Band call their ancestors those who remained. There's no hierarchy in the phrase, no judgment, just the plain fact of what happened. But in a genomics laboratory, those who remained and those who walked are two distinct population clusters. The forced march divided a nation geographically. The DNA tells us it divided them biologically too. Into this already fractured landscape, a population split between Oklahoma and the Appalachians, its ancient diversity compressed by a lethal march, one more force was about to arrive. One that would make the question of Cherokee identity not just scientifically complicated, but legally explosive in ways that are still unresolved today. The freedmen, thousands of black people enslaved by Cherokee citizens, people who were promised tribal citizenship after the Civil War, whose descendants carry something in their DNA that the Cherokee Nation has spent nearly 2 decades trying to legally erase. And what that DNA actually contains is the most uncomfortable truth in this entire story. After the Civil War, the United States government required the Cherokee Nation to extend citizenship to the formerly enslaved people who had lived within their borders. The Cherokee freedmen were enrolled. They received land allotments. They were legally and formally Cherokee citizens. For 40 years, nobody seriously challenged that. Then in 2007, the Cherokee Nation held a tribal vote. 76% of citizens voted to remove the freedmen from the rolls. The stated reason, no Cherokee blood. Here's where it gets complicated. And I mean genuinely, honestly complicated. Not the kind of complicated where one side is clearly right. The enrollment document used to determine tribal citizenship is called the Dawes Rolls. So it was compiled between 1898 and 1914 by United States government agents, not by the Cherokee Nation. And Kim Tallbear at the University of Alberta spent years studying exactly what those agents did. What she found was this. The Dawes Rolls separated enrollees into Cherokee by blood and freedmen categories based not on genealogical research, but on visual racial assessment. What the enrolling agent saw when he looked at a person determined which column they went into. If he saw a black person, they went in the freedmen column, even if they had verifiable Cherokee ancestry that was simply never recorded. The enrollment criteria being used today to exclude the freedmen were written by the same federal system that caused the Trail of Tears in the first place. So hold on to that, because the DNA is about to make this legal argument collapse from underneath. When DNA testing has been conducted on Cherokee freedmen descendants, the results are not simple. Most do carry significant African ancestry, reflecting their enslaved heritage. But a meaningful portion also carry indigenous American haplogroup markers, the same ancient pre-contact Native American lineage signatures we've been talking about this entire video. And in documented cases, those freedmen descendants carry stronger genomic evidence of ancient Cherokee ancestry than some currently enrolled tribal citizens whose families documented citizenship through intermarriage with white settlers in the 19th century. The people being excluded have more biological evidence of Cherokee descent than some of the people doing the excluding. Smerrilyn Vann, the president of the Descendants of Freedmen of the 5 Civilized Tribes, has a family paper trail connecting her to the Cherokee Nation across multiple generations. Her exclusion from the tribal rolls was upheld through federal legal proceedings. She has the documentation, she has the ancestry, she doesn't have citizenship. The Cherokee Nation's legal position is that citizenship is determined by the Dawes Rolls alone, a document they did not create, administered by agents they did not choose, encoding racial categories they did not design. And yet that colonial instrument is now being used to enforce their own sovereign identity. The genomics doesn't simplify that contradiction. It makes it deeper. But here is what makes this story even more complicated. When there is a third population, one that no legal proceeding has ever addressed, one that no DNA database has adequately captured, whose genome may be the most genomically ancient Cherokee lineage currently present in any living person. They are not enrolled. Most of them have no idea what their DNA contains. And to find them, you have to go back to the mountains. Deep in the Appalachian highlands of North Carolina, Tennessee, and Virginia, there are communities that have existed in geographic isolation for centuries. They have traditions with no documented European origin. Some speak dialects containing structural elements borrowed from Cherokee. and when genomic sampling of these communities has been conducted, but researchers have found mitochondrial haplogroup A2, one of the 4 founding ancient Native American lineages we confirmed at the start of this video, at frequencies far higher than what appears in commercially enrolled reference populations. Think about what that means. The people who score highest on the specific genetic marker that defines ancient Native American ancestry, they're not on any tribal roll. They're not recognized by any government. They've never been the subject of a single mainstream DNA documentary. They're living in the mountains where the Cherokee have always lived, carrying the DNA that the Cherokee have always carried. And officially, according to every legal system that matters, they don't exist as indigenous people. These communities are sometimes documented under names like the Melungeons, Weecher in Virginia and Tennessee, and smaller unnamed groups scattered across the Southern Highlands. Their racial classification under Jim Crow was violently contested. Some census records listed them as free persons of color. Others labeled them white. A handful were enrolled in state-recognized tribes that the federal government refused to acknowledge. Their genetic profile is unlike any other population in the eastern United States, a combination of ancient Native American lineage, sub-Saharan African ancestry, and Southern European markers that suggests a history of extraordinary complexity played out across centuries of mountain isolation. But here's where it gets strange. The same genetic combination that was used to deny these people legal rights under Jim Crow is also the exact combination that genomically authenticates their Cherokee ancestry. The racial tools of oppression and the molecular tools of verification are pointing at the same people and delivering opposite verdicts. Donald Yates at DNA Consultants in the United States spent 11 years studying 119 Cherokee descendants across 3 phases of research. What he found was something nobody had predicted: Haplogroup T, a maternal lineage associated with ancient populations in the Middle East and Eastern Mediterranean, constituted 22.7% of the Cherokee mitochondrial DNA in his sample, appearing consistently across unrelated families, across geographically dispersed participants. So Yates and his colleagues concluded that this distribution predates 1492. It is not post-contact European admixture. It arrived in the Appalachians through a migration route that no existing population model has yet explained. This finding was made over a decade ago. It's sitting in published research right now. Almost nobody has covered it. In 1973, the Eastern Band of Cherokee Indians reviewed its enrollment criteria and removed a number of families from the tribal rolls. Many of those families were from exactly these Appalachian communities. Had genomic sequencing existed in 1973, it would have told the exact opposite story. The families being removed carried some of the oldest Native American DNA in the region. The administration removed the people most likely to be the genuine biological inheritors of the Cherokee lineage. So petitions for enrollment filed by some of these families, with genealogical documentation and genomic evidence attached, have been returned. Not rejected with stated grounds, returned, as if acknowledging the question itself was too dangerous. Because if these families are accepted as Cherokee by genomic evidence, it doesn't just add names to a list. It forces a complete renegotiation of what Cherokee identity means, and it implicates the institution currently controlling that definition in a suppression that has lasted more than 50 years. The Cherokee Nation has an official position on DNA testing. It will never be a criterion for tribal membership. And honestly, that position makes sense. There's a long, ugly history of scientists and governments using biological claims to strip indigenous people of their rights, their land, Bichifo, and their children. The instinct to refuse that tool entirely is understandable. It's protective. It comes from experience. But here's where the Cherokee case becomes categorically different from every other tribe that holds that same position. The Cherokee Nation didn't just refuse DNA as evidence. Their representatives participated in shaping how that science gets communicated to the public. And the outcome of that participation made the genomic picture of Native American ancestry less specific, less accurate, and less useful to the exact people who needed it most. Nanibaa Garrison at the University of Washington documented this in a 2018 paper published through the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. Representatives of federally recognized tribes, including Cherokee Nation, participated in closed consultations with commercial genetic testing companies about how Native American ancestry results are reported. The stated goal was sovereign protection. tribes, not corporations, should define indigenous categories. That's a reasonable principle. But the practical result was this: the regional specificity that would allow a DNA result to distinguish Cherokee ancestry from Navajo ancestry or from Mesoamerican Indigenous ancestry was deliberately flattened. The granularity that made the test meaningful was removed, and there are three outcomes of that decision. The third one is the one that matters for this story. So outcome one, corporations can no longer be blamed for misrepresenting tribal specificity. The tribes consented to the blurring. Outcome two, the genomic evidence that could validate freedmen claims, Appalachian isolate claims, and disenrolled family claims becomes harder to use because the reference panels that support it are now less specific. Outcome three, and this is the one: the institution that was supposed to benefit from genomic truth is the same institution that made it harder to access. The Cherokee Nation, in protecting its sovereignty from corporate exploitation, inadvertently protected itself from its own genomic record. I want to be fair here. Every decision I just described had a legitimate reason behind it. What makes this a story isn't malice, it's consequence. Wait, it's what happened to the people who needed the answer most. A geneticist involved in this research, speaking without attribution, put it plainly: we have the tools to map indigenous American ancestry at a resolution that would resolve most of these disputes definitively. The political cost of the answer is too high for everyone involved, so the answer stays theoretical. The data exists, the technology exists. The ancient Cherokee genome, with its deep Beringian roots, its anomalous haplogroup T signal, its unresolved complexity, is sitting in open access databases right now. What's missing is not the science. What's missing is the will to ask the question the science can answer. And in that silence, something even older has started to surface. Because inside the ancient Cherokee DNA record, buried beneath every haplogroup anyone expected to find, there is a signal that should not be there. A signal that connects the Appalachian Mountains not to Asia, not to Beringia, but to something far older and far stranger. And the researcher who found it spent 3 years trying to make it disappear before she accepted what it meant. The signal has a name. Researchers call it population Y, after the Tupi word for ancestor. And it was found not in the Appalachians first, but deep in the Amazon rainforest in 2015 by a team working out of Harvard Medical School. Dr. Pontus Skoglund, now at the Francis Crick Institute in the UK, had been working on the genetic history of the Americas for years when his team found something they genuinely did not expect. When in the DNA of two Amazonian indigenous groups, the Surui and the Caritiana, there was a genomic signal that bore measurable similarity not to East Asians, not to Siberians, not to any population that should have crossed into the Americas through Beringia, but to indigenous peoples in Papua New Guinea, Aboriginal Australia, and the Andaman Islands, on the other side of the Pacific Ocean. His team spent months trying to make it go away. It got stronger every time they tested it. This finding was published in Nature in July 2015. It received modest academic attention. It has never appeared in a mainstream documentary. It is not in any school curriculum. It was made over 10 years ago, and most people who follow this topic closely have never heard of it. Population Y is not a contamination artifact. It's not a modeling error. Multiple independent statistical methods have confirmed it. It represents a real population, now extinct as a distinct group, that contributed a small but real percentage of the ancestry of certain Amazonian peoples. This population reached the Americas through a migration route that current models still cannot fully map, possibly along the Pacific coast, possibly before the main Beringian founding wave. Their source population in Eurasia no longer exists as a distinct group. They left almost no trace, except in DNA. And now, researchers are finding the faintest echo of that same signal in ancient bone samples from the eastern United States. Think about what that means for the Cherokee story specifically. And if population Y's descendants reached the Appalachian highlands, if traces of that ancient lineage survived in the pre-contact ancestors of the Cherokee, then this is not just a story about colonial disruption of a well-understood indigenous people. It becomes a story about the last surviving fragment of one of the oldest and most mysterious human migrations ever to cross this planet. And here's the detail that cuts right to the bone. In Cherokee cosmology, the Cherokee didn't migrate to the Appalachians. They were placed there at the beginning of time. They have always been there. For generations, scientists dismissed that as mythology. The genomics is beginning to suggest that the distance between we were created here and we have been here longer than any other people may be smaller than anyone assumed. Well, the paper documenting the Appalachian connection to these ancient signals was published in a peer-reviewed journal. It received limited coverage. The data is in an open access database right now, available to anyone with the tools to read it. And what it points toward is not a resolution. It's a door that leads into the oldest unanswered question in the story of the Americas. Here is what the DNA has confirmed. The Cherokee are real. Their ancient lineage is real. Their presence in the Appalachian Mountains stretches back thousands of years. And the people who claim that heritage most loudly, who built their entire family identity on a Cherokee princess ancestor who lived in a story and never in a grave, carry none of it. Not a haplogroup, not a marker, not a molecule of proof. That part is settled. But here is what the DNA has not resolved, and may never resolve. Whether the genomic continuity that was fractured by colonialism, compressed by the Trail of Tears, miscategorized by commercial testing companies, manipulated by institutional politics, and used to exclude the freedmen and the mountain families. Whether that continuity can ever be reconstructed into something coherent enough to serve as the foundation of a legal identity. Because identity is not a haplogroup, but haplogroups are now being used to decide who has one, and those two facts are pulling in opposite directions, and nobody in a position of authority has resolved the tension between them. The most genomically Cherokee person alive today may be an unenrolled woman in North Carolina who doesn't know what to do with a DNA result that no institution will honor, while the least genomically Cherokee person alive today may hold a tribal citizenship card, a federal enrollment number, and full access to the sovereign benefits built on the suffering of people whose bones lie in mountains they were never allowed to return to. In the Cherokee language, the word for story and the word for truth are the same word, not metaphorically, linguistically. The same syllables carry both meanings. For a people whose identity has been contested by census records, federal courts, commercial databases, and their own tribal government, the question of which story is true is not academic. It is the entire architecture of survival. The ancient DNA is still being extracted. The population Y signal is still being analyzed. Yes, the mountain communities are still waiting for a legal framework that can hold the complexity of what their genomes are telling us. And somewhere in a database, in a sequence that hasn't yet been cross-referenced against the right reference panel, there is an answer to a question that nobody has thought to ask yet. The DNA always remembers. It carries everything that happened to a people across thousands of years, the migrations, the survivals, the losses, the entanglements, and it holds all of it, patiently, until someone with the right tools decides to look. The only question is whether we're willing to hear what it says, even when the answer dismantles everything we built our identity upon. If you've made it this far, you already know the answer to that. The next bloodline we open is older than this one, stranger than this one, and closer to home than anything we've covered yet.